Today, we are here to celebrate the paperback release of this book, Vesper Flights by Helen Macdonald. First, I'd like to turn things over to Stephen Harper of the North Cascades Audubon Society, our co-sponsors for this event. Please welcome Stephen.
Well, thank you. North Cascade Audubon is proud to be co-sponsoring this event with Helen Macdonald this afternoon. One of North Cascade Audubon's primary missions is to provide people with inspirational tools to learn to appreciate the value of birds, other wildlife, plants, and the natural environment. Hopefully, this appreciation stimulates action to protect and preserve birds in the future. We have presentations, classes, field trips, and other resources which can be accessed on our website. We are, however, just one voice, and we need other voices and actions of all types to help us achieve our goal. Helen Macdonald is one of these voices. In her previous book, H is for Hawk, and now with Vesper Flights, Helen is able to connect people with birds and other animals to understand what they need, what they can teach us, and what their connection is to us. She provides the human connection that is often not present in factual scientific presentations and descriptions. Emotional attachment is so important during these times when we are experiencing the rapid decline of birds. So I am honored to present Helen Macdonald and welcome her as she talks about her newest book, Vesper Flights. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for that beautiful introduction. And, I really hope that I can come visit some of the forests around you at some day and do some birding. That would be magical. And it's great to be with you all, seriously, tonight. I am in my house in rural England. It's 10 p.m. So I will do my best not to it be too incoherent from it being late for me. I'm a real early to bed person, but this is a great joy. So as many of you know, H is for Hawk was my first sort of book that people read. And that was a memoir, really, a story of how after my father's sudden death, I decided to deal with my grief by training a goshawk. Not something I recommend anyone do, really. It was a very intense experience. But my new book is a collection of essays on various subjects and everything from sort of mushroom hunting to glowworms, going to the Andes with a bunch of space scientists, lots and lots of different things, lots of swans and lots of swifts. And this is the bird on the cover. I'm sure many of you know swifts. The species we have in Europe is the common swift, Apus apus. It's a very weird bird. They live in the air like fish live in the ocean. They have tiny feet that can't even walk. They really can just cling to surfaces, vertical surfaces. And their wings are so long that if they land on the ground, they find it almost impossible to take off again. They really are like the sort of fish of the air. And so I'm going to start this talk really by reading a bit from the book. A very dear friend of mine, Judith, who unfortunately and very sadly died last week, was one of Britain's foremost experts in rearing orphaned baby swifts. So partly in her honor and partly in honor of swifts themselves, I'm going to read a bit about what it's like to release one of the swifts that she reared. It was an extraordinary experience. So what you do with a swift, baby swift, is, they've been in these kind of cute piles in sort of on paper towels in these sort of boxes, really, and she's been feeding them until they've become ready to fly. Is you hold your hand up into the wind with the bird on it, and then you just wait for this bird to take its first flight. And this is what it's like. So we're in a local village sports field in England. All I can do now is wait. The swift stares into the wind for a while and then starts shivering. Anticipation, I think. Functional explanations, this bird is warming up its pectoral muscles ready for flight. Emotional explanations, anticipation, wonder, joy, terror. The sensitive plumes growing between the feathers of its sleek sides and wings are being brushed by the breeze and feeling their element for the first time. Nothing has visibly changed, but something is happening. It's like an aircraft avionics system coming online as it powers up, blinking lights, engine check, check. But that doesn't work though, not quite as an analogy, because what I am watching is a new thing making itself out of something else. There is no doubt in my mind that this is as much a transformation as a dragonfly larva crawling from water and tearing itself out into a thing with wings. On my open palm, a creature whose home has been paper towels and plastic boxes is turning into a different creature whose home is thousands of miles of air. Then the swift decides. It tilts the pug-sharp, tiny tip of its beak upwards, arches its back, and drops from my flattened palm, making an aching series of stiff and creaky wing beats. For 5 or 6 seconds, everything feels wrong. The bird is a mere foot above the grass, and my heart is beating fast. Up, 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 calls Judith. But nothing is broken. We're just watching a bird learning to fly. Hitching as if pulling into gear, the swift starts to ascend, flickering up and up into a sky streaked with evening cirrus cloud. It describes one careful circle above our heads, then lifts even higher and straight lines it to the south. I look down at my palm. There's a little scratch on the meat of my thumb where its claws had gripped tight before letting me go, gripped tight to the hand that was the last solid thing the bird would touch for years. It was very emotional. These birds, once the young birds leave the nest, they don't land for 2 to 3 years. Everything is done in the air. They feed in the air, they drink on the wing, they bathe in rain. They are astonishing. And I hope that catches some of the ways in which I obsess a bit about swifts in this book. So essays, yeah, well, why essays? I mean, for years, the only emotion this word produced in me was a kind of dull panic. I was the kind of child who never did their homework on time. And at university, it was even worse. And I remember the disappointment on the faces of my tutors as I yet again failed to produce the essay I was supposed to have written that week. Sort of slowly as the weeks went on, used to turn to sort of exasperated irritation. But now I love essays to distraction, because they seem to me to do things that longer pieces of creative nonfiction can't do. They feel like exercises in fierce attention. They're sort of fashioned from love and curiosity and wonder. They remind me a little bit of what it's like when you go for a walk and you find interesting things. You know, you might find a kind of a hatched eggshell or a snag of fur on a fence wire, or maybe a sort of a CD glittering in the long grass being chucked out of someone's car on the verge. So that the sort of moment of their creative inception, the moment I sort of think about starting to write an essay, is also, it just reminds me of those kind of focused moments when your attention on a walk is drawn from this sort of background blur of green and gray onto something specific, some single thing that you want to look at more closely to try and understand what it is and what it's doing. So basically writing essays, it seems to me, and it's one of the reasons I love this book is writing it was so much fun, is that it seems as if I'm puzzling something out, but with a reader. There's always a sort of reader standing behind me when I write these. They sort of open out these kind of spaces for thoughts that they always seem somehow shared rather than delivered. And I'm sure many of you know that sort of nature writing, it's got a long history, a beloved history for me of books being written in the voice of sort of God, right? The voice of the expert, the voice that somehow seems to be a little bit like, aren't you lucky as a reader to have me to just, you know, to explain this to you? And that's one of the reasons I love writing essays about nature. It seems much more of a kind of shared thing. And I also feel my brain is kind of wired to write things of this length, and it makes this book very special for me. I'm really, really proud of it, actually, this strange child that I have made. And some of them were written for other places initially, like the New York Times Magazine or the New Statesman in Britain. And many were written just for the book. And despite the fact that they all came from different places, as this collection came together, this really weird thing started to happen. This is going to sound again a bit woo-woo, but it started to feel a bit like the essays were talking to one another in the book across their different subjects. So, and they began to reveal these kind of deeper themes that ran right through the book. And inevitably, they're sort of the themes that are coursing through this historical moment. They're about belonging and exile and fear and wonder and love and loss and despair and home. Because obviously we're living in really frightening times. I know what you've all been through climate-wise recently, and you know, we've got the climate emergency, we've got biodiversity loss. You know, this is a much more politically overt book than H's for Hawke, and I'm kind of glad about that, you know. But I'm the kind of person that doesn't like being told what to do. If you ever meet my mother, she will testify to this. I'm very contrary, and I'm not a very good polemical writer. I'm not very good at that. But I think what I tried to do in this book is to point at things that I think generate wonder, a kind of attention, a focused attention on the natural world, because obviously you don't want to protect anything if you don't know it or love it. And that's really, I think, where the book comes from. So it's a book about where we are now and how we're trying to, maybe we can sustain some hope at a time when it's in really short supply. And hope is a really big deal in terms of what this book's trying to do. And it's I think Mariame Kaba has said it's a kind of discipline we have to have now. And it matters most when it's hardest. And the wonderful writer and thinker Rebecca Solnit talks a lot about this. You know, she says, you know, if you're full of optimism, you don't do anything. And if you're full of despair, you don't do anything because there's no point. Both of those things stop you from acting. And what hope needs is uncertainty, right? I mean, that prizes open a space for us to feel we have some power to affect what might happen in the future. She says, to hope is to give yourself to the future. And the commitment to the future is what makes the present inhabitable. And those lines are really sort of part of what this book's trying to do. But there's a lot of me in it. So if you've read H's for Hawke, you will know me as a very miserable 30-something full of grief. But there's a lot of small me in this book. So there's a sort of small child whose knees are covered in scrapes and grazes from falling out of trees, catching snakes and running around kind of in a sort of quite a feral manner. And then there's me, the angst-ridden university student prone to disastrous love affairs. And then there's a kind of 30-something me living in a terrible house in Wales, who at one point gets so bored, I decided to stalk a herd of steers on the hill behind the house on my stomach. I mean, this is a very odd thing in this book. It was a very eccentric job, that one. I just got some notes here, so I don't want to bore you all. What I want to do today is basically talk about one of the deepest themes of the book. And I'm going to do that using a bit of autobiography to kind of give it a story. And it's the story of how I came to understand some really important things, I think, about the relationship between the human world and the natural world, and how those realizations shaped the way I think and write, which led to this book. And I hope the story might sort of shed some light on more general aspects of our relationship with nature, and how, weirdly enough, I think that stories about nature tend to, at heart, always be stories about ourselves. So going right back, when I was 5 years old, my parents moved to a house in the south of England that happened to be in an old country estate owned by the Theosophical Society. I don't know if you know of the Theosophists. It's a kind of 19th century spiritual, esoteric movement, really. Yeats was a very famous member of it. My mom and dad were not religious or spiritual. They were journalists, right? They were kind of hard-bitten journalists. It was kind of surprising they moved there. They bought this freehold house there. And growing up there as a small child was a very unusual education. People wandered around in their pajamas. Sometimes they wandered around in nothing at all. And there were kind of meetings and fires and seances and all kinds of very esoteric goings on. But there was also this amazing environment that there were kind of Italianate formal gardens, and there were huge climbable trees, specimen trees and parklands and ponds. I just went completely feral across this landscape. There was a summer house across the road that was beloved of Arthur Conan Doyle, apparently. And our neighbors were all elderly ladies, and they were all wonderful. Like, there was one woman who had a scarab necklace that was given to her by Howard Carter. Another one kept a great auk egg in a drawer. And they were all had these pasts of luminous weirdness and sort of eccentricity. And I guess, looking back on it, they'd all lived hugely privileged lives, but I'm really grateful to them now, because what they did was giving me this, they'd all kind of stuck two fingers up at the prevailing attitudes of their time as to what they should be. And I think they really did give me the sense that I didn't need to conform to the script, the cultural script of how a life should go for a young girl in growing up at that time. But this estate was really cool. It was like really, it was walled, and so it was very safe. And I had this childhood that was really, really unusual, I think, today. I was able to spend hours and hours on my own. And what I did was look for life. It turned me into a naturalist. So I filled jars and aquaria with kind of, frogs and newts and tadpoles. And I turned over rocks and looked for bugs. And there was a meadow that I used to adore. And that meadow was really important to me, because I think as a child, you grow up and the scale of your life is kind of a human scale. It's the scale of a house, right? Rooms, playgrounds, yards. And suddenly I was lying in the grass of this meadow and putting my face into the grass and looking into this tangle of stems and seeing these tiny insects like the size of punctuation marks. And then I was kind of looking up at the sky and, burying myself in the clouds. And these just made the world much bigger for me. And I used to really want to know what all these creatures were that I kept finding. So I got really into field guides, and I learned as many names as I could. And I learned the names a bit like you kind of want to learn the names of your friends at school. I mean, that's kind of how it felt to me. And they made the natural world to me seem a place of really complicated but beautiful safety. So I think that, so many of the myths that we hold about nature these days, for a long time now, are about testing ourselves against it, or setting ourselves against it, or defining ourselves or defining our humanity against it. But this was nothing like that. This was like a child's way of looking at nature. And I was really obsessed with birds, as you might know, particularly birds of prey. I thought they were the coolest things that the world had ever made. I still kind of think that, although parrots are kind of pretty high up the list now, actually. Don't tell the hawks. But so I flew hawks. I kept hawks. I flew hawks. I was a kind of little baby falconer. And then I went off to university to study English literature. And because my maths is so bad, I couldn't be a biologist. And suddenly there was no time to fly hawks anymore. But something happened when I was at university. And that was that I think I learned how to read for the first time properly. And I discovered that books weren't just full like full of sort of stories, and the poems weren't things a bit like songs. That what they were the kind of keys to understanding the societies that had made them. They were kind of they were shaped by this sort of social and historical context, and I was really fascinated by this. And I forgot about hawks. I got really into kind of post-structuralism and all this sort of stuff, and I smoked a lot of filtered as camels and wore a lot of black. I still wear a lot of black, but basically, yeah, that's kind of where I went. And then after university, I went off to, as you do, I went off to the Gulf states, and I worked in this job, which was to do with the conservation of the kinds of falcons that were being used or affected by Arab falconry. Falconry is a huge deal in the Gulf states. It's an enormously important cultural thing there. And what happened was I kept seeing all these conservation initiatives that were being suggested by Western conservation organizations. They kept failing, because no one was paying very much attention to the vast sort of emotional and cultural significance that these birds had to the people who kept them and flew them. And I thought, this is really interesting. So what I did then was go back to university, and I decided that I really worked out what my subject was. And it wasn't literature. Surprisingly, it was the curiosity of that small child who was turning over rocks and looking at insects. It was a curiosity about how we use animals to teach us how to live. And I thought what I'd do is I'd use all the ways that I'd learned to analyze books and poems, and I'd try and analyze our relationship to nature, which was kind of not really a very big subject back then. Academically, wasn't really particularly well looked at. And I got really, because I'm British, I got really interested in the Second World War, because it's such a huge deal in terms of how Britain sees itself. So I went to the University Library, which is this huge dusty building, modeled on the ancient library at Alexandria, amazingly. And I poked around in the periodical section, and sort of, again, very eccentric. I sort of thrive in eccentric environments. And I called up all these books from the 30s and 40s, and I wanted to kind of work out what Britain thought of nature at a time of war as an example of how we do it more generally. And it was really interesting. So what happened was, I just assumed, like everyone, that we sort of see science as a subjective, dispassionate way of looking at the world. But I discovered that the underpinnings of science are just about as much about ourselves as the animals and plants that we study. So, like, for example, one of the people that I got really into those days was a scientist called James Fisher. Back then, naturalists were pretty much all very, very posh, and they wore a lot of tweed rather than Gore-Tex. And during the Second World War, James Fisher got really obsessed with this one bird called a fulmar. It's kind of like a sort of miniature albatross. And they were spreading their range at this point right the way through Europe really, really fast. And it was to do with like sort of fishing boats. They were kind of feeding on fish that had been chucked out of fishing boats, but they were spreading like, wildfire. And he got really obsessed with them. And he wrote this big book, this scientific monograph about these birds. And if you read it, it's just extraordinary. I mean, he was written, during the war, and he talks about the encirclement and penetration of the British coastline by these birds. And he got military coastal command stations to watch for fulmars as well as enemy aircraft. And he even got the Royal Air Force reconnaissance training flights to photograph their nesting cliffs. And he keeps saying, I don't know where they're going to stop. When are they going to stop? They're encircling our country. So you read this book that's just meant to be science, and it's basically all about invasion anxiety, and it's all about the war. And I just kept reading more, and I discovered how bird migration studies became really, really popular at this time too, at a time when everyone was staring at maps of, national borders being crossed. I read about British officers who were interned in German officers' prisoner war camps, who watched birds obsessively to keep sane behind the wire. That's how they kept themselves together. And then when they left and came back to Britain, when they were released, a lot of them started campaigns against cage birds, and it's not hard to see why they did that. That was their world that they had been in. And then there was more stuff. I remember laughing actually at one point that it was discovered by scientists that the larks that were feeding on wheat in the east of England in the winter were actually flying over from Germany across the sea. And all the local farmers started shooting them. And there are all these headlines in the local newspapers saying, these farmers are saying, skylarks that sing to Nazis will get no mercy here. Everything gets complicated and tangled up. I'm sorry, these examples are so great, I can never stop. So Peter Scott, the very famous naturalist who was the son of the Arctic explorer, I remember when he was sailing from Britain on the decks of his destroyer, he was in the Navy, he looked back at the cliffs of Dover and he realized that the reason he wanted to go to war was to fight to protect the ducks that nested in the reeds behind his house. Because to him, those ducks meant England, which is kind of bonkers because these species nest all over Europe, but you can see how national and natural history get really, really confused. There are radio programs that said, British landscapes look very much like American landscapes, but if you know your bird song, you will never, you'll never be lost. You'll know which country you're in. So knowing your countryside, knowing your animals was like a part of a kind of almost like a nationalistic thing. So what I was doing was discovering that when you talk about nature, what you're kind of doing inevitably is talking about yourself and your culture. And that was really interesting. A lot of this kind of material is what ends up in different ways in the ways I analyze the natural world in Vesper Flights. I hope it isn't too dry. I just find it endlessly fascinating. So what basically we do is I always think of that Baudelaire amazing quote from the poet Baudelaire. It's not, I can't remember the original French, but basically said, the greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince us that he didn't exist. And we do this with nature all the time. We're told that it's the one place that's free of human meaning, but it just is where we put all the really big meanings, because if we see those big meanings in nature, we can think they're natural, right? So if anyone who's watched a wildlife documentary about big cats in Africa and what they're doing will know that sometimes it feels very much like they're talking about people's relationships, not cats' relationships. I think about that amazing essay by Annie Dillard. I'm sure that many of you read it, about her meeting a weasel. It's a beautiful essay, and she exchanges glances with this wild weasel, And she says, you know, for 60 seconds, I was in that weasel's brain and he was in mine. And just really a beautiful moment of sort of communication across a recognition of awareness across the species boundary. But then she goes on to say that the weasel has the perfect freedom of single necessity, right? It's the kind of Nietzschean creature. It kind of teaches us to grasp our one necessity and not let it go. And all I could think is, you know, Annie, this is a genius essay, but living weasels aren't just sort of Nietzschean, you know, wolves of Wall Street, right? I mean, they're not just beings of pure will and necessity. You know, they have kids, they sun themselves, they're secretive and they're solitary, or they might have a aching leg, or they play, right? Animals are always more than we want them to be. They're always more than the meanings we give them. So what I was doing at the time when I was doing all this was going out into the landscapes around the university in Cambridge, and I was trying to go bird watching, and it was hysterical. So I grew up in kind of forests, a bit like, you know, where you guys are, and suddenly I learned how to look at birds and animals in those environments. And suddenly I was in this very, very strange, for me, wetland environment. There were these, you know, huge banks of like reeds, and I would wander around and get incredibly frustrated. You know, you couldn't see anything. These huge reeds and these kind of, you couldn't walk into them. They were like the ocean. They were impenetrable. They kind of waved in the wind. They wouldn't support your weight, and they were full of life. You just couldn't see it. And I would, to start with, I'd spend ages sort of sitting there by binoculars, like at Lemon, you know, looking down these kind of very sort of narrow corridors of water between the reeds, hoping that I'd see something, and I never really saw anything at all. And then I realized that, you know, I had to listen, right? And I learned to tune into noises that would guide my eyes. So I'd hear the faintest splash or a creak or a call, and that's where my attention would be gone. I'd never really thought about listening as something that I needed before. We was, you know, bird guides are always about what things look like, not what they sound like. It sort of taught me a lot of field craft. And sometimes I'd look for the spot and I'd see nothing. And sometimes I'd see all sorts of things. I'd see like a party of these cool birds called bearded reedlings. They look a bit like balls of cashmere with like these huge cartoon feet. And they've got these kind of weird pale eyes and mutton chop moustaches. They're very cool. Or I might see a warbler, or I might see like a snake or whatever, or an otter, even if I'm lucky, but only ever in pieces, right? Because the reeds were everywhere. So I learned also that the encounters I had with animals in that space were never like the pictures in books, right? I would see the little bit of a wing of an eyebrow of a bird, or an upcocked tail, or I might see a little kind of flash of brown fur, which was an otter. And the more I saw these creatures in these little tiny snatches of views, the more distinctive they became to me. And every sighting that I had sort of started to pleat and button and stitch the animal and the habitat it lived in together, right? Until those animals became completely indivisible from the landscape they lived in. They became part of it in an incredibly strong way. They were an animate part of that particular habitat. And that was a lesson I'll never forget. I never forgot that way of looking at the world. And that also is another really important thing, I think, in that book, that sense that you can't really pull a creature from the landscape it lives in. And I thought a lot on those walks because, you know, I was on my own usually. And I thought a lot about other things to do with the countryside and nature too. And I think that one of the things we often also think is that being out in the natural world gives us solace, and it offers us refuge from persecution and judgment of others. You know, it's a safe place. But of course, it's not free of social meaning either. You know, for a long time, I struggled with this intuition that because I wasn't a man, I didn't have the authority to really talk about nature. I didn't really know what I was talking about. It wasn't mine to talk about. You know, I'm kind of over that now, but for a long time I felt like that. And as you know, there are like so many voices that the world has not been given the opportunity to hear, writing about the natural world and more genuinely. You know, some of the most talented naturalists I know I've ever known grew up in working class rural communities, and there's very little room for them in today's cultures of nature appreciation, and even less room in the culture of nature writing, because it always tends to kind of entrench this way of looking at the landscape that's sort of distanced. You know, you're supposed to interact with the landscape by walking through it and looking at it, rather than actually sort of touching it and getting involved with it. It's a very interesting kind of division there. And I think there's a lot of social history in that. So yeah, basically, I mean, this is a really obvious point, but more than ever, we need more voices, right? Writing about the natural world. We need more variousness. We need to hear the words of Black writers, writers of color, people from marginal communities, queer writers, trans writers, women writers. We need all those voices because nature isn't a singular thing, and nor are we. And we need, I think, to really try very hard to kind of think about the fact that diversity is a strength in both the natural world and in us. That's my little speech there. So I guess the big Thoreau, to go back to Thoreau, because we have to, right? The big question, the big Thoreauian question is how to live. And I guess just to give you a kind of sense of my answer to that really is it's all the lessons that I've just been talking about have taught me there isn't really the right way to look at the natural world. But we really have to fight with all we have for lives that are not like our own, to delight in a world full of things that are not us and love them because they're not us, right? And we have to mourn. We have to mourn what's disappearing through habitat loss and through pesticides and the climate crisis. I mean, it's terrifying right now. I mean, I think we've had 75% of insects in Europe have vanished since I was a child. It's an invisible disappearance, and it's really frightening. So there are all these things that are making the world quieter and darker and smaller, and there's a lot of elegy in writing about the natural world. There's a lot of bearing witness, I think. But we need to feel that grief. We need to feel it and not dissociate ourselves from it. We need to be able to mourn in order to change ourselves, I think. And I always think of that astonishing line from Robin Wall Kimmerer. I don't know how many of you have read her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which has been re-released and is doing brilliantly. I'm very pleased to see that. And she talks about meeting a group of students and talking with them about the natural world, and all the ways they talked about it were what I think there's a technical word for it. I think it's called declensionist narratives, which means all the ways you talk about nature are always about how we're destroying it. They're always narratives and stories about ruin and destruction. And she asked these students, what would it be like if you felt the earth loved you back? And I read that sentence and my eyes filled with tears. I cry a lot. I'm very sentimental, but that was one of the strongest and most beautiful things I've read my whole life. What would it feel like to think that the earth loved you back? And that's something I think of often to give myself strength to go through. So I think that, again, I keep quoting people. I'm in quoting mood tonight, but the lovely poet Frank O'Hara wrote this great poem about the Martinican poet Aimé Césaire, and he has this line in it, we have to fight for what we love, not are. And I think that's another thing that I always, So yeah, we have to believe that nature's ours, right? No matter who we are, we should get out there and pay attention because it's yours too, right? No matter who you are, it's yours. It belongs to you as well. No matter what historical or cultural boundaries have been set up and policed against you, those sort of thriving, growing, flying, swimming, damaged, broken, beautiful things that are yours too. And I think that one of the themes of this book is that sense, as I've just talked about, of trying to open up just to look at, not just to celebrate the natural world, but to try and understand why we think of it the way we do, why we value some creatures and landscapes more than we value others, and why we value others less than we value others. And I think it's really crucial work for us to think hard about that when we go out there or look at creatures. Because if you look at a creature and you try and think about all the meanings that humans have given it, sometimes you can push them just a little bit aside and you can look past them to the weird, alien, strange, astonishing thing that is the animal itself. And the real magic, I think, is that sometimes, and they're like moments of grace for me, sometimes you can be out there and you can see an animal, or an animal can look at you, and the animal will do that magic for you. And I really do believe there's a whole essay in this book about the divine. I'm not a religious person. I don't have faith, but there are moments in the natural world which seem to get us close to a sense of luminousness, of presence that feels religious. And I've learned really to actually start to You know, so I tried in Ages of a Hawk so hard to write about some of these experiences, and I didn't have the language for it. And it took me a long time to realize that to find the right language, I had to go to these sort of theology 101 books, right, to find the right words to talk about it. So sometimes these animals can provide these moments of grace, and they can give you that magic. So I'm going to just remind you, one of those moments for me, very special moment, was a few years ago. I was on book tour, in fact, in New Zealand, which is a very strange place for me because I was very similar to, I think, climatically to where you are, in the sense that it sort of reminded me of home, right? It's sort of temperate generally. But it seemed upside down for me because I kept thinking that on the bottom, which is like so childish, but it felt that everything was sort of turned on its head and was upside down, or kind of a negative version of itself, which was a very weird intuition to live in. And I'm walking up this very grassy kind of sun-crisp autumn fall headland in New Zealand, and there are these swallows, these lovely welcome swallows, carving these curlicues above my head, and far beneath, down at the bottom of the cliffs, there was a kind of little pocket of warm salt water, a kind of like a little pool, natural pool, and there was sort of young sea lions porpoising around in it. It was really great to watch them for a while. Well, I was really nervous. My heart was in my mouth because I'd come here to see this one thing, and I wasn't sure whether I'd see it at all. The air was very, very still, and I knew that it had to be windy for this thing that I wanted to see to happen. And the sky was this kind of remote blank blue color, and down at the bottom of the cliff there was this kind of little speck that was a kind of fishing boat, and I remember watching that. It was like the size of a sort of thumbnail, and I was with some people, and we just sort of narrowed our eyes and waited there, and we waited for ages, and I kind of thought, well, whatever. And then the wind came, and the wind came very suddenly, and it was a benison, it was a blessing, and it rolled in off the ocean, and right in front of us in the grass, this kind of weird wobbly lump of white started to move, and it raised these kind of awkward stick-like arms that were covered in fluffy down. It looked a bit like a kind of a small child in a ghost outfit. It was a baby albatross, right? A baby royal albatross, and it sat there for 100 days, looking out to sea, still being fed by its parents. And because I was a literature student, I thought, of looking out to sea, of Theseus's ships, and then the black sails coming home, and of Coleridge's albatross and Baudelaire's albatross, and all our imperial visions of, when I say our, I think, again, my British upbringing, there's a sort of sense of imperialism that's sort of caught up in inevitably in how one sees one's history. And I was thinking about all that, and I'm thinking about guilt, about human guilt, like Coleridge's and albatross, about what we're doing to the natural world. And I got really preoccupied by all this as I stared at this little ghost child with its stick-like arms. But the wind kept going, and the wind kept blowing. And then the albatross came. This albatross came, and it was too big to understand. It was like a dog was hanging there in the air, and it came in on the wind, this long knife-like wings bowed like this, and it had its webbed feet spread like rudders. It was the most astonishing thing. I'm getting quite feels, as they say on the internet these days. I'm getting the feels. And as it curved in, it turned its head towards me, and it looked at me down these kind of mild, sort of dark Madonna-like eyes, and its long squid-cutting beak. And I was absolutely lost for words. Its world was wind and sea and spray and salt, and the uplift from rolling swell over the southern oceans. And it looked right through all the stories I'd ever been told about the world. And the air shivered with its newness. So that's what animals can do. And I really hope that those moments come to you, these moments of grace. And it's really funny, they come out of nowhere. I sort of laugh about it in the book. I say, you can go out there looking for these moments, and you can sort of think, right, today's the day I'm going to have to find something amazing. And you just get rained on or covered in mud. I think this sort of notion that the world can be made anew with a creature is something which is really important to me. I also think that it's really important to remember that those encounters don't need to be with big exotic animals. There's been a lot of talk with the pandemic, I think, of how, certainly in the early days of this terrible grim period, I kept hearing people say, you're all right. You can go out into the woods and the fields, and you can, it's safe out there on your own, and you can get solace in being in nature. And I just kept thinking, yeah, right. But what if you live in a city and you have limited financial means? You can't just go out for a walk in the mountains, right? I mean, that's really, pretty. And I thought a lot about how we talk about the natural world as a place of refuge and solace, and how it can change you. And I thought about this amazing piece by the philosopher Iris Murdoch, who was also a novelist, as many of you know. And she wrote about this experience called unselfing. It's a good philosopher's word. And she says, look, imagine you're sitting by a window and you're consumed with worries about your life, about your loved ones, about work, whatever, human things. You're just really anxious. And you look out of the window and you see a kestrel hovering, or she says a kestrel hovering, it could be anything. And you look at the kestrel really, really hard. And she uses this great phrase, until the world becomes all kestrel, right? Kind of radical empathy. And then when you pull yourself back into yourself after that moment of radical empathy, you will find that the anxieties you are having about your own life have been lessened because you have in your imagination shared it with a creature that's not human. It's a lovely movement. It's very utopian and very unhelpful in some ways, but I just kept thinking, look, and it's possible to do that. In lockdown, I got really obsessed with the spiders in my downstairs toilet. I'm a terrible housekeeper. I'm so messy, but I remember looking at this. There's one above my cooker, my oven as well. These spiders that were protecting their little egg sacs and looking after their little precious corner. And I kept thinking, what's it like to be a spider, right? What sense of the world does a spider have with its 8 eyes and its little fluffy feet? And of course you can't know, but the attempt to imagine what that corner of my house would be like for a spider was enormously freeing. It made the world huge. It ballooned out into this huge space when I realized that this isn't just one place, this house. This is a place for many, many things, and all of them experience it differently. And that's, if you think about the world more generally, it just ramifies out into sort of the world becomes infinite. I think about people just trying to go to space at the moment. It's like, why? This world is full of infinities, and we're walking around inside them every single day. We just have to pay attention. So that's my talk. I feel I've gone on a bit. I feel I've been a bit, I talk about I'm not polemical. I seem to have been a bit polemical this evening. I hope that wasn't too much. It's one of those days. But I would love to hear questions, and thank you for bearing with me there, my little autobiographical witterings. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was amazing to listen to, Helen. And there are a lot of great questions in the chat. We will try to get to all of them.
Oh, here we are. I'm going to close that. And I'm going to...
I think the first one is part comment, part question. It was Michelle, I believe. Sorry, I copied the questions all so they're together, but I
well done,
left the names out. It was Michelle. Here it is. I absolutely loved H is for Hawk. I became fascinated by hawks while watching the New York Times webcam on the red-tailed hawk nest on the window ledge outside the New York University's president's office. It was amazing to watch the whole process from eggling to fledgling. I was terrified until all of them successfully fledged. And I was moved to tears by parts of your H's for Hawk book and sad that Mabel died. Did you train any other raptors after that?
Yeah, I mean, just two things to say quickly about the nest cams. It's so easy to get consumed in those. And I love those. There's always this story about how modern technology is like a kind of it's dividing us from the natural world. And I'm just like, look, the sights you're seeing on a webcam would never be visible to anyone except maybe an ornithologist in a hide, right? Those cameras are democratizing things for us that we would never otherwise have seen. So it's overjoyed that they exist and that, that you got to see that. I haven't trained another hawk. one of the great ironies of this, of H's for Hawk doing well, is I travel a lot, right? I travel a lot now, and I think keeping a hawk is a huge responsibility. You know, you need to help it achieve a life that's as close as possible to that of a hawk in the wild, which means flying it every day. You know, I don't have the time or resources to be able to do that now, but I hope in the future I would like to do that. Yeah, I'd quite like another hawk one day. Watch this space. It probably will happen. I miss Mabel though.
And then there's another question here. Deborah asked this question, and I know your birds are important for education, but are you ever conflicted by the abuse they suffer in the hands of some men? Can you talk about that and any solutions you might have for the problem? And I know you touched a little bit on that.
Do you mean
the conversation?
The falconry birds kind of thing, the what we're talking about here? What kind of, do you know, I don't know what kind of birds you mean. Sorry to be dumb.
Let me go back to the question.
Yeah.
See, I know your birds are important for education. Right. Are you ever conflicted by the abuse they suffer in the hands of some men? So just, I don't think it's
I don't know. I mean, it's a very difficult question. So if we're talking about falconry, which I think we're talking about here, it's a very interesting thing to talk about. I mean, it's a very, very old relationship. You know, it's been going on for thousands of years, and unlike other animal-human relationships, you know, birds of prey have never been tamed or domesticated. They've always been brought into the house, and they've always been these kind of, they've become this symbol of wildness in a way that other creatures haven't, right? They've always represent sort of untamable spirit or whatever. I mean, they're amazing creatures. In countries like the United States, I think you'll find that falconry, and I hope I'm answering the question, falconry is one of the most highly regulated activities that one can do. One needs to have a mentor, one needs to pass examinations, one needs to have one's premises where you keep the hawk inspected. You know, I think there are very few cases of any kind of cruelty being visited upon birds of prey in the United States. In other parts of the world, perhaps, right? Like, you know, there are always people who don't know how to look after each other, you know, like it's a bit like T.H. White, you know, in my book. You know, he really did love this hawk that he had, but he didn't have any of the tools to know how to love this hawk or look after it, or indeed love himself or look after himself. And it was a horrendous experience for the bird. So, you know, we are flawed. And I'm very glad that, you know, there is a lot more enlightenment now in terms of the fact that creatures like birds are sentient creatures with emotions, and they experience pain and suffering. And, you know, for a long time, people didn't even think that was the case. So, yeah. And you know, I think also, you know, we're talking about philosophically, we're talking more widely about how many animals now are being classified as non-human persons legally. So they have a lot more protection. I think that slowly we're coming towards a place where creatures, but we're all hypocrites, right? I mean, you look at a lot of farming methods, you know, intensive methods. There's a lot of suffering baked into those. You know, I know some very good farmers, but, you know, there are things that go on in the world that grieve me, and it's a question of trying to work out where to place one's moral concern. And you know, do you decide to fight for the continued existence of all life on Earth through climate change activism, or do you campaign against, you know? It's really, really tough one. It's a really tough one. But yeah, it's a tough question. I do my best where I can, I guess, is the answer I have to give on that one.
Yeah. Christy has a question. She wants to know the name of the writer that told the story about.
Oh no, I've lost you. I'm going to see if I can find Christy myself. Oh my God, there's so many questions. Look at you all. This is amazing.
Being seen by nature.
Sorry, I missed that, I'm afraid. I'm sorry. I'm sorry you froze. Christine
that's okay. No worries. She wanted to know the name of the writer that told the story about being seen by nature. Was it Murdoch?
Being seen by nature. Was that me just here? Yeah. Oh, you mean the bit about
so.
Loving the earth, not the bit about loving the earth back or being seen by nature. God, my brain is like Swiss cheese. Is it in the question section?
It's in the Q&A. Yeah, she just wanted to know the name of. You mentioned the writer.
Told the story about.
I think you mentioned it today. Yeah.
I'm gonna have a little look through my notes because I can't.
No worries. No worries if you can't remember.
I'm gonna.
Christy, you can always go back and watch the YouTube.
Yeah.
Oh, Alice Murdoch. Okay.
Yes.
It looks like she found it. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. I'm so sorry. Iris Murdoch. Iris Murdoch. IRIS.
Oh.
MURDOCH. And the word is unselfing. I'm so sorry. That was a really good question, and I'm just being a bit doofusy.
Oh, no worries. And then, okay, so the braiding sweetgrass author.
Yes, that's
okay,
Robin.
Yeah.
Robin Wilkiner, who is in.
Yeah. Thank you to the people that helped out with that in the chat. Bay, I hope I'm saying that right, has a question. Has your view of your father's death changed in the year since you wrote H is for Hawk? And would you write it differently if you were to write it today?
Mm-hmm. I guess it's changed in the way that I think everyone's griefs change. I get very angry when I still get angry at people. I hear people say, oh, people get over it. You never get over a loss like that. You don't get over it. You just become a person that can hold that loss within you and deal with it. I mean, you become kind of bigger in a way, and the loss is still there and it's never going away. It's just love, right? So there's distance. I still feel sometimes I can hear my father telling me off when I'm not doing DIY stuff properly. And he says things like, right tool for the job, Helen. So yeah, my view of his death hasn't changed. Would I write the book differently now? I wouldn't write that book now, I think. I think it was a book that came of a particular moment. And I needed to write that then. I just don't think it's possible to write a book. To write that book now. Too much time has gone past, and oddly enough, again, but maybe that's because that book's success has changed me. I am, in many ways, a much more secure person, and just from having suddenly got a place in the world. I was a broke, academic with no money and very miserable anyway at that time. And then my dad's death kind of floored me. So I guess I wish, I mean, ironically, I wish he could have been around to see the book do well. I think he'd have really liked that, and I still miss him. He was a good man. So that was really not an answer to the question at all, but he was a good man and I miss him. And no, I haven't really changed how I think about his death.
I think this is the last question. Okay. Deborah is wondering who you're reading these days.
Well, at the moment, I'm reading some wonderful science fiction by N.K. Jemisin.
That's my next event, actually.
Really? Please, can you kind of worship these books? So yeah, I read lots of stuff, and one of the terrible things about it, I mean, it's not terrible. It actually just makes me feel guilty. Is that when you have a book that's a success, you get sent lots of books to blurb, and then they just pile up, and I just feel more and more and more guilty. So I end up reading mystery novels and science fiction instead of nature. Terrible. One book that I constantly recommend to people if they haven't read it yet and they're interested in natural history and nature writing more generally is Home Place by J. Drew Lanham, which is basically it's the most astonishing memoir about home and identity from a Black ornithologist. And he is an astonishing writer and an astonishing human being. And it's just a really important book. So if you haven't read Home Place by J. Drew Lanham, please read that. It's beautiful. Really beautiful book. So that's one I recommend hugely. And Jemisin. So yeah, science fiction is go.
Which one are you reading? She has a lot.
I can't believe I've spent so long not having read them, So
right.
I was reading it the other night and I fell asleep and had the weirdest dreams about wandering around these sort of the landscapes full of kind of earthquakes and, you know, it was very, very strange. It was like being in a kind of Renaissance fair in my head. It was great.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that's great.
cool. That was an odd way to end, but it's been great. I just want to say before I go, as just a question, someone just said here, have I ever spent any time with herds of horses in the wild? And the answer is no. I am catastrophically allergic to pretty much all mammals. Dogs, cats, rabbits, deer. I just can't. I just unfortunately, much as I would like to spend time with horses and dogs and things, I'm stuck with birds. So I'm very sorry about that.
Birds are great too. All right. So I am going to send into the chat here. There we go. The link to the Village Books website where you can find Vesper Flights. You will also see H's for hawk and the fish one. I forget the title, sorry. You can also find her other two books there. Okay, there we go. Also, in my message is the link to the Village Books YouTube channel where you can return to this event and watch it. Our past events are also uploaded there, the virtual ones. Yeah, so if you want to recommend it to a friend or rewatch the event. And
I'm still squirming about the Iris Murdoch thing. I can't believe I did.
Oh yeah, no worries. Thank you so much to our audience members for joining us today. It's always lovely to have you. You always have such great questions and you're really present, even though we're not in the same room. And thank you, Helen, again, so much for joining us today. It was a wonderful event. Great to hear you talk about your book. And do you have any last words, Helen?
No, I'm just really sorry that I can't hang out and have a cup of coffee with you now after the event like I'm supposed to do in the kind of hang out with all the booksellers and meet all the audience. You know, it's, you know, I really hope that in the future I might be able to visit in person. I just want to thank everyone for coming and everyone. I want to thank North Cascade Audubon and I want to thank, you know, everybody. This has been a really lovely event and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you.